140 million people displaced from their homes. Climate change and extreme weather events are displacing people in record numbers. Droughts, forest fires and floods are changing lives around the world. So what should be done about it? This is Inside Story. Hello, a warm welcome to the program. I'm Hazem Sika. Our climate is changing at a rate that has exceeded most scientific forecasts. Natural disasters linked to climate change are forcing millions of people from their homes every year. The United Nations says the number of so-called climate refugees could reach 300 million by the middle of this century. Drought, floods, fires and extreme temperatures can leave entire communities and cities without shelter, clean water and basic supplies. Well, scientists have gathered in London for Europe's first conference on the issue of climate refugees. Activists from the group Campaign for Climate Change say this displaced population needs urgent international protection. It says in the last 6 years, more than 140 million people have been forced to move because of natural disasters linked to climate change. The UN estimates at least 21 million people have been displaced by weather-related events, including floods, storms and wildfires every year since 2008. People in Asia experience more natural disasters than any other region. In 2015, 85% of the world's climate refugees came from South and East Asia. Well, in the US state of Louisiana, rising sea levels are forcing people to relocate. The residents of Ile de Jean-Charles, most of whom are Native Americans, are among the country's first climate refugees. Andy Gallagher has their story.
For generations, life on Ile de Jean-Charles has remained unchanged. The fertile waters of Louisiana's coastline provide a way of life people here cherish. But this is a community that's slowly being taken back by the sea. Just one flood-prone road connects residents to the mainland, and as sea levels rise and land is lost, life is becoming harder.
Well, this is where we live for the past 7 years, on and off.
Violet Handen-Parfait was forced into this trailer after the family home was lost to storms, and she's now desperate for help.
My kids should not be sleeping right here. They should have their own rooms, you know? And it's hard.
The government has granted $48 million to move this entire community, but progress is slow. Many realize that Ile de Jean-Charles is living on borrowed time, but the prospect of losing tribal lands and culture is wrenching.
I have all my cousins here. I'm related to everybody over here. You know, and over there, okay, if they keep us together, we'll be okay. You know, but some people don't want to leave here. But that's their choice. Well, man, I don't have no choice. I got to do this for my grandkids.
If the people here are the first climate change refugees in the United States, it seems almost certain they won't be the last. Louisiana's losing around 75 square kilometers of land every year, and as we've seen here, it affects the poorest communities. And environmentalists say this is just the start of things to come.
For every mile of coastal wetlands we have, it reduces storm surge by a foot.
Darrell Malik-Wiley blames much of the land loss on oil exploration, but says global climate change is being ignored.
It's something that for too long the government, both federal and states, have not addressed the issue, so now it's right in their face. And they need to do something about it, and they haven't figured out what they're going to do about it.
If what's happening here then is a test case, it's a sobering one. The Biloxi Chitimacha Choctaw tribe now face an uncertain future, and one environmentalists say could affect millions across the globe. Andy Gallagher, Al Jazeera, Ile de Jean-Charles, Louisiana.
One of the largest glaciers in Antarctica is melting at an alarming rate. An international team of scientists is sailing around the continent on a research mission. Our science editor, Tarek Bazley, is with them.
Finding a sheltered place to park a ship off Antarctica can be a problem, but not on this occasion. Running the nose of the 12,000-ton Russian research vessel up against the glacier gives the scientists on board the perfect platform to carry out their work. This has to be one of the most extraordinary places on the planet. I am on the edge of Antarctica, and what you see behind me is the Mertz Glacier. This glacier runs from the East Antarctic Plateau right down to the sea, and when it reaches the sea, the glacier comes out 40 kilometres over the ocean to where we are here. Scientists are fascinated by this particular glacier because in 2010 an enormous chunk, around 75 by 35 kilometres, broke off after it was nudged by another larger iceberg. Using this $5 million robotic submarine, the scientists had hoped to look at what they thought would be a vertical wall of ice dropping 500 metres from the surface. But to their surprise, the team discovered a huge underwater cavern beneath the glacier. The seawater was warmer than they'd expected, and there was surprising evidence of melt.
So we went really close to the ice and discovered that it was kind of really rotten ice. Everything was kind of melting away, a lot of kind of holes in the ice, and yeah, completely rotten. We were not expecting that on the glacier really, and especially not at this depth and kind of so far into the glacier.
The discovery is consistent with other findings in this part of Antarctica. Scientists have found warm ocean currents are now flowing further south, resulting in increased glacial melt. This team are keen to know what effect this is having on life on the sea floor and deploy the submarine again. Here, at a depth of 900 metres, they have a rare opportunity to take samples and observe a wide variety of cold water species.
To have the capacity to take those sorts of images and collect specimens and know exactly where they came from is amazing, and to witness the behaviour at the same time, the beautiful moment where the holothurian, the sea cucumber, was dancing. In such an unexplored environment, everything is of interest.
The samples will now be taken back to the scientists' labs. Numerous tests, including DNA analysis, will be carried out to create a map of this rich and diverse marine environment. The Southern Ocean produces a large part of the nutrients that support life in the rest of the world's oceans. Changes here will affect us all. Tarek Basley, Al Jazeera, Mertz Glacier, East Antarctica.
All right, well, let's now get the thoughts of our guests. Joining us from London is Asad Rehman. He is the head of international climate at Friends of the Earth, the organisers of the conference. Sterling Burnett is the research fellow on environmental policy and managing editor of Environment and Climate News with the Heartland Institute. He joins us from Dallas, Texas. And also in London, we have Jonathan Neale, who is the coordinator with Global Climate Jobs. Good to have you all with us, gentlemen. Asad Rehman, just tell us from your point of view, how serious is this problem, and what do you hope this conference will achieve?
Well, I think you don't need to be a rocket scientist now to know that there is something extremely wrong with the world. We see extreme weather impacts happening, from super typhoons, floods, droughts, famine, and they're impacting people in every part of the world, and people see that in reality now. Millions of people suffering drought at the moment in Africa, collapses in agriculture, people losing their homes as sea level rises. And this, of course, is the tip of the iceberg. We know, and the climate scientists warn us, that these impacts are going to get much worse and much faster unless we stop our addiction to dirty energy. But the reality now is that there are millions of people already being impacted, and the question now is, you know, what right do they have? What kind of legal protection do they have? The majority of people who are being displaced or being impacted by climate change are impacted internally within already poor countries or move to other poorer countries. 83% of all known refugees and migrants stay within those poor countries. And the question I think the world and community now needs to answer is, you know, how do we protect those most vulnerable people? How do we protect people who are internally displaced in countries? And how do we protect those people who seek safe haven to neighbouring countries? At the moment, there is no legal protection, and that's one of the things that this conference is talking about, and then secondly to talk about how we build the kind of power and the demand to make that a reality, to win that at a global level, but also ensure that countries do their fair share. Unfortunately, at the very moment we need more solidarity and people to be able to work together. The forces of extremism, of hatred and xenophobia are rising all around the world and want to build walls and fences and dividers. This conference is also about how do we unite people to have a better vision of a safer world and a more equal and a right for all people to have dignified life.
So how do you do all that then? I mean, you bring up a lot of questions there. What does need to be done to convince people, particularly at the government level?
Well, look, first and foremost, I think what we need to begin, and it's been recognised, John Kerry, the former Secretary of State, said in a speech in 2015 that the issue of climate refugees was going to be one of the most pressing issues that governments were going to face. We know now that already the UN is having major discussions about large-scale migration of people. People recognise that this is an issue and it must be addressed. The reality is it's not being addressed adequately or fast enough. What we're pushing for is that the UN, and particularly in the UN climate negotiations, address this, begin to discuss the idea of a legal protocol that protects climate refugees and migrants, and that we set ourselves that as a goal, and we begin those conversations, and we aim that by 2018 we have the beginning of that sort of protocol being discussed. The reality is people can't wait. People's lives are being lost, and they require now the global community to do something about it.
Jonathan, Neale, I mean, we mentioned at the top there that some of the figures, 140 million people have been forced from their homes because of natural disasters and climate change. How do we arrive at that figure? I mean, how do you distinguish between those who are moving for purely environmental reasons and those who are leaving for, you know, political and socio-economic reasons and war and that sort of thing? And is there an overlap there?
There's an enormous overlap. The 140 million is the people who are only being displaced by climate. But if you look right across the Sahel, if you look at all those people who are desperately trying to come across the Mediterranean, those are people who are coming from areas where first there was climate change and the grass disappeared for the cattle, the water disappeared for the farmers, then there was war, and they moved to cities where there was no work. So it's all of those things happening together. But if we give people who have been displaced by climate the right to come through, then they can get round all of that. But we have to welcome, humanity is making the planet unlivable. And these are our brothers and sisters who are facing the consequences. And we need to welcome them as our brothers and sisters, give them homes, give them livelihoods, give their children schools. We would do this in any functioning community. And we need to see the world as a community.
So how do you address those? Just talk about how you address those, not just at the government level, but on the grassroots level.
We have to build mass movements. If you look at what's happening in the United States now, of all places for everybody to turn out in mass occupations of airports in defense of Muslims, of all places, the United States, tens of thousands of people in the United States are doing that. We have to build movements like that all over the world. In the United States, but in Europe to welcome people, in India to welcome people who are driven out of Bangladesh, and so on. It's an enormous task to do this. We've got to turn around a wall of racism that's been coming to people, a wall of xenophobia. But as the scale of the tragedy gets bigger and bigger, I'm hoping that humanity, that collectively we will realize what we face and we take care of each other. But that has to be the starting point, not what are we afraid of, but what are we going to do for each other? And that possibility of starting with people's best natures provides the possibility of building a mass movement.
Sterling Burnett, what's your take on this? And I want to ask you, first of all, if you believe that climate change is real and it's man-made.
Anyone would be a fool to believe that climate change wasn't real. Climate change has happened throughout the history of the Earth, and humans are contributing to current climate change, but largely on a regional scale through our landscape changes, through the way we've altered ecosystems. Your report mentioned Louisiana. What's going on there is not rising sea levels, it's subsiding land because of the way we have butchered the coast for shipping, to channelize rivers, we have destroyed a lot of the land down there, and we're making it less able to mitigate seas and storms, but also it's subsiding. But that's not some kind of change in climate caused by humans. Sea levels have risen 400 feet since the last ice age, and they'll continue to rise until the next ice age comes. Climate change, to the extent it's contributing to it, is a small fraction of the rise in sea levels every year.
What is your take on the issue of climate refugees then? I mean, we mentioned the talk of putting up walls and putting up barriers, and that this is not a constructive way to go forward. What's your position on that?
Well, I don't deal with immigration policy. That's not my area of expertise. In looking at the numbers that I've seen, I don't see there's 140 million refugees right now internally or externally displaced by climate change. Most of those refugees are displaced by war. And in fact, the wars have come before any supposed climate changes. What we know is, for instance, crop yields worldwide are setting records year over year regularly. Droughts are regional. Rainfall declines are regional. It's not a global phenomenon, and it's not clear you can link any particular drought or rainfall decline to human-caused climate change. They've happened historically. We weren't talking about climate change when we were talking about Ethiopia 20 years ago. We weren't talking about climate change when we were talking about starvation in China and Russia in the last century. This is a terrible, but not an unusual phenomenon, unfortunately.
Asad, Rehman, you were shaking your head to some of that.
Well, you know, listening to the Heartland Institute is like probably how Galileo felt talking to the people who believed that the Earth was still flat. The reality is that the climate science is so settled. Human being and human activity, largely driven by our addiction to dirty energy, is driving climate change. The impacts are happening. We can see it with our own eyes now, the climate science. Frankly, the idea that we are still debating the role of human activity in climate impacts absolutely gone. The idea that we're debating whether the extreme weather the impacts that we're seeing around the world have anything to do with climate change, that's been settled. We've seen numerous studies, we've seen peer-reviewed studies, we've seen all the renowned climate scientists, the evidence is there. The question now is, do we have the political will? And what the Heartland Institute, what others are trying to do, is still slow down that political will. And the reality for people around the world, and not just in poorer countries, although, of course, the poorest people in the world are the ones being most impacted by climate change, and they're the one that least responsible. At the moment, 50% of the world's poor, of the world's population, are only responsible for 10% of global emissions, while it's the richest 10% in rich industrialized countries like the United States are responsible for half the global emissions in the world. It's those rich countries now that have to take action, not only in terms of changing the way that they produce and consume energy and food and their economic model, which is driving global inequality, but also fans the flames of those inequalities. Now, the speaker there talked about conflict. We know that climate change exasperates conflict. We know that water scarcity is leading to more conflict. We know as crop yields crash and collapse in certain parts of the world, that's leading to more conflict. Climate change fans the flames of all of those inequalities in the world. But the response that we have to see is, first and foremost, yes, we have to change how we're producing and consuming our food and energy, but we have to recognize that now impacts are happening and what we do about them. The reality is that majority of the people who are being displaced are displaced in poor countries. They're not happening in richer countries, but rich countries have an obligation. We have to be able to provide finance to be able to help people grow better food, produce energy more cleanly, not use the same dirty industrial model that we've faced. The clock is ticking, and really we don't have time now to start thinking about, trying to win over either climate denialists or climate skeptics. And the reality is now there's a change of tack from the climate skeptics. The climate skeptics now start with the point saying, we agree that climate change is happening, but now we query how fast it's happening. Look, this is done and dusted. Let's be actually serious. The world's community in every single community and every single country has recognised this,
Jonathan
including
Neale,
the United States.
How urgent is this for you? How much of a race against time is this, do you think?
It's a race against time. and we don't know the timetable. Because climate change is a physical event, it will have feedback effects. Those feedback effects will speed up, and they will speed up steadily, and we don't know the scale on which they will speed up and how quickly it will happen. But we already know that there was an enormous drought in the state of Texas. We already know that 100,000 people didn't go back to New Orleans after Hurricane Katrina, that 2 million people lost their homes in Nigeria in the floods, that another 2 million people lost their homes in Pakistan in the floods. We know that this is already happening. We know that there are wars all across the Horn of Africa, which are being stoked by the fact that the grass and the crops are dying. And poor people are battling each other for the little bits of water that is left. We know that's already happening, and we know in the lifetime of my children and my grandchildren, we know that this will be the greatest challenge humanity has ever faced. And to face it, we are going to have to behave differently.
Sterling Burnett, you said earlier that this is more of a regional issue than a global one. What do you base that on? Because so much of the studies that have been done on this say the opposite. They say that it is, as we've just been hearing, this is a global phenomenon, and the evidence for this is overwhelming.
They say that these studies show that, but the studies that I look at show that, for instance, extreme weather. Rainfall is not getting more extreme. Hurricanes are not becoming either more common or more powerful. In fact, we're in a hurricane drought in the U.S. We haven't experienced a larger than 3-category hurricane in over 9 years, a record. Drought, well, yeah, you know what? I sit here in Texas. We haven't had a drought for more than 2 years. We've been out of that drought, so you're talking history.
Yeah, but climate change is a phenomenon that is measured over several years, decades even. I mean, where does a couple of years fit into all of that?
Well, hold it. Well, then let's be honest about it. Not just decades, centuries and centuries in geologic time scale. That's how climate change occurs. But it occurs regionally more rapidly. It's called an average. Everything in the average isn't the same. You know, if you look at test scores and you have a 94 average, it doesn't mean anyone got a particular 94 grade. Well, the truth is about climate change. Rainfall falls more dramatically in one area at one time, and then they seize on the climate, the people who believe humans are causing the vast majority of climate change, seize on that and say, oh, look, it's extreme. No, it's falling there at one time at high levels, but historically it has done that sometimes before. Just like in Texas, we've had droughts before. California has had droughts before. Historically, if you want to look at history and decades and centuries, we've had 100-year droughts in the U.S. before, and we're not experiencing anything like that today. In Africa, in the Sahel, it's gaining grasslands, not losing land. The CO2 in the atmosphere is reclaiming land.
Sterling Burnett, if I could just ask you, though, because a lot of people will be listening to, hearing what you're saying, and will be asking, if you're prepared to say that climate change has changed in the past, then why do you not believe that it's happening right now?
I do believe that it's happening right now. I have no doubt that
but you're not convinced that it's happening on such a scale.
Climate change happens on a variety of scales. I'm just saying it's not clear we can attribute the present climate change, at least the vast majority of it, to human activities. I've said humans play a role. I just don't believe the evidence shows human greenhouse gases are driving something globally that's happening. Just whether humans are responsible for the vast majority of the current climate change. And I don't think the evidence is in for that.
Asad, Rehman, I'll give the last word to you briefly, if you will.
Well, look, this is the view of a lunatic fringe. And let's be realistic about this. This is the same people who think that climate change is a Chinese hoax. This is the reality is that 97% of the world's climate scientists recognize that climate change is real, human activity is causing it. Every country in the world, every government in the world, apart from now the United States, because that we have a White House with climate denialists in there, recognize this as a global challenge and that we need a global resolution. The US, its own institutions, its own scientists, its own military, its own business people all say that this is one of the greatest challenges that they need to face. The reality is what we're talking about and we're hearing here is a small fringe element of people who are overwhelmingly paid by fossil fuel industry, who want to try and distort and slow down the message and change the reality that we must act, and we can act not only to tackle the climate crisis, but create a much better world.
All right, that is going to have to be the last word. Thank you, Asad, Rehman, H. Sterling Burnett, and Jonathan Neale. Thanks very much for being with us. And thank you for watching. As always, you can see this program again anytime by visiting our website, aljazeera.com. And for further discussion, you can go to our Facebook page. That's facebook.com/AJ Inside Story. You can also join the conversation on Twitter. Our handle there is @AJ Inside Story. For me, Hazem, Sika, and the whole team here, bye for now.